1066 and the Norman conquest was a pivotal year. England's prosperity had attracted many envious eyes. William of Normandy came to these shores bearing the Pope's standard and blessing. His Holiness was determined that those unruly English be forced to conform to European standards. More by luck than judgment, William defeated the English. Every true Englishman should feel a knot in his stomach at the mention of the Shield Wall and Hastings. An English army that had just defeated the Vikings and then marched the length of England had left too many of its finest on northern battlefields. However, it is with pride I note that only 24 ships out of a Viking fleet numbering over 300 were needed to carry away what was left of the rapists, slavers and murderers. The English fought well that day in October, making sure that over 1,000 Norman knights joined them in their fate. The Normans acknowledged their bravery by refusing to allow the English dead to be buried until years later. Again, a small number of foreigners would dominate the country. However, much of English culture would remain intact. The Norman French, with their Catholic concepts of divine rights of kings, politically held England back for hundreds of years before English values were strong enough to reassert themselves. However, this was a time when changes in language would reinforce and entrench the class system. When deciding to learn English, Voltaire commented that English was just like French pronounced badly. With 2/3 of English words having French origin, he had a point. Yet probably the total number of French-speaking Normans that settled in England was under 10,000, coming to a country of perhaps 1.5 million English. However, the English elite had been totally replaced. Less than 5% of the land in England lay under English control after the Norman conquest. The English county system of hundreds and shires was left intact. After all, it was very effective for collecting taxation. However, it was English underlings that collected the taxation and ran the country. The number of Norman French names is far greater than the number of people of Norman French descent. The builders of Powys Castle in Wales were of Welsh descent, but took a Norman name to better fit into the elite. Those with pretensions of grandeur, the middle class, perhaps in that time uttered the phrase pretentious moi. Sadly, the aspirational middle class of the 11th and 12th century were no better at pronunciation than those of the 4th and 5th century. They got it wrong. There's no more ridiculed pattern of speech than the English working class dialect. Though it would be a disciplinary offence to mimic in a derogatory manner a Pakistani or West Indian dialect, it is acceptable in the 21st century to ridicule a West Midlands, Newcastle or Liverpudlian accent. In fact, those purveyors of cultural norms, the BBC, often portray the fool or villain with a working class English accent, while the hero has the standard English or foreign accents the BBC are so proud of. Villain's an interesting word. Many English were given the title villain after the Norman conquest. It was a type of serf, bonded worker. The connotations it now has, someone not to be trusted, a breaker of the law, reflect the contempt that the Normans, and perhaps even more so, their English middle-class henchmen, had for the working class. The working class was slower than their middle-class betters to adopt standard French-based language. It is perhaps why English has maintained most of its Germanic structure. It is however interesting that the names of animals in English are based on Old English, while the names of meat products come from French. Hence, sheep give us mutton, cows give us bread. Was it that the English looked after the animals while their fine products were aimed towards the Norman French and the middle-class English, who ate the French with such enthusiasm? Dialects like those of the West Midlands maintained a more Germanic structure and even some Germanic language into the late 20th century. How bist? Bisn't to bad could be heard in Cradle Heath in the 1980s. How are you? Not too bad. The Normans weren't all bad, and are often given a bad press. An example could be Braveheart, a film that fails to mention the fact that Robert the Bruce and William Wallace were both of Norman descent. No doubt some Norman lords did abuse their authority to take advantage of local women, but so did Welsh lords, Scottish lords, and for that matter English lords. The fact is that women are attracted to confident, powerful men in authority. A Norman lord would have had plenty of English, Scottish, or Welsh women willing and keen to enjoy his company. Perhaps their religious beliefs tempered their lust to a degree. The Normans were always good Christians, if not always good human beings. However, there is no evidence that the Normans exercised the right of the lord to bed a woman on the first night of a marriage. No mention is made of this at the time of the Normans, and the Normans had plenty of enemies that would have recorded such events. Interestingly, Kurdish Muslim chieftains maintained the right to take Christian Armenian brides on their wedding night until the early 20th century. The Normans learnt much in the Middle East through their crusading activities, but thankfully the systematic rape of women on their wedding night wasn't one of those things. One concept that the Normans did take from the Muslims was chivalry, an idea that again deepened the class divide. The elite of the Anglo-Saxon army were the housecarls, full-time warriors who saw death in battle as the greatest honour, surrendering being the greatest disgrace. Anglo-Saxon warriors had much in common with the samurai, who they preceded by nearly 1,000 years. The English broadsword was pattern welded to make its structure similar to that of the laminated Japanese sword, the katana. Even their liking for ornate jewellery and bright colours, evidenced from the Staffordshire horde, would define both sets of warriors as psychotic peacocks. The chivalric knights cannot really be defined as warriors. The knights would try to capture, not kill, the opposing knights, then ransom their defeated foe back to their families. Of course, ordinary soldiers would be killed or sold into slavery. Those with the most to gain stood a good chance of not losing their lives, while those coerced into fighting stood a far higher chance of losing their lives. The English put an end to the perversion of chivalry at Agincourt. English peasantry, banned from carrying swords, took to the Welsh longbow, making it even more powerful. Their ancestors' skill with the 5-foot-plus battle axe was maintained through the quarterstaff. At a critical point in the Battle of Agincourt, King Henry saw the captured French prisoners a potential threat. He asked the middle-class English men-at-arms to kill them. The men-at-arms were reluctant. Many stood to gain from ransom of the prisoners. The lower-class archers did the job without hesitation. The bowmen could have looked forward to at least having 2 fingers being removed if the battle had been lost.